All right, we are live. Welcome everybody to Noetic. Tonight we'll be discussing Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper. This is a text I was totally unfamiliar with, and it was requested by the lovely Jordan Cline. So before we get into it, I want to say this about what we're trying to do here at Noetic. I think first and foremost, we want to provide a community for individuals to talk about big ideas, and that's what you can do when you download the Noetic app and the reiterations of that are coming down the line. And then secondly, there's a lot of talk in this post-election malaise or whatever about challenging narratives. And this personally was something that challenged my own sort of narrative, getting outside of my obsession with located philosophical truth and trying something more perspectival. So I think a lot of people will get something out of this, especially since I am no expert in feminist philosophy, feminist theory, and this is often interpreted as a seminal text in American feminism. So I had a lot to learn. So we can jump right into it, because I think if anyone's listening to this, I think a lot of people understand that we love this text, that they may love this text. Jordan, why did you select this?
I don't know. I just kind of thought we were going off with the sort of the Hawthorne kick, and I don't know. It just seems like other than Simone de Beauvoir, it was like time to introduce some more kick-ass ladies.
More ladies, yeah, totally. And CJ, did you enjoy it?
I did. I read this first in my sophomore year of undergrad, I think as part of an American studies, which also included literature, and this being, again, like you said, lumped under feminism. But I enjoyed it, I think, a lot more than maybe my first go-around, and I think that was because of the audiobook that you presented to us, that maybe you can dive into depth a little bit to, or at least get the details of, which really encapsulated the story for me. But I'm excited to talk about it. I'm not really sure how it's going to go, but I'm excited regardless. So,
well, I think it can go in a multiplicity of ways. I think my experience was this, is that I was talking to a good friend about this. I think if I were to make the movie, and there are movie adaptations of this out there. PBS did one in 1989. I believe Jordan watched another one. Yep. I think you could, there's like at least 7 or 8 different movies here, and we'll talk about that, about what exactly the plot of this story is. Let's give a little bit of background information first, and a lot of this I'm going to be drawing from Wikipedia. You might be saying to yourself, what the heck is The Yellow Wallpaper? And it's a 6,000-word short story, and I already alluded to this. It was written by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. And we're going to hear a little bit more about Charlotte Perkins Gilman in a second. But it was first published in 1892 in the New England Magazine. Now, does this feel like something that was written in 1892? Because to me, this felt like a very modern thing that contemporaneous readers, people who are listening to us or whatnot, can get so much from. This did not feel dated to me at all.
Why didn't it feel dated to you?
Maybe it's because I think a lot of elements are borrowed in our culture already. Like, I kept thinking, I tried to imagine what the narrator looked like as she's confined to the upper room in this mansion or whatever. It reminded me of the woman from the Ring. I wonder if this is an archetype that is in a lot of horror movies and extremely gothic movies and things like that. So it felt like something I was familiar with, even though it was written over a century ago. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know, did it feel old to you? Did it feel antiquated? Is it still relevant? I think also some of the feminist themes that it deals with are very much alive today. It seems like a lot of people are intensely interested in one of the waves of feminism. We'll talk about what the different waves of feminism are and how this might be an endorsement of some of those waves of feminism. Mm-hmm. So,
let's do it.
Anything else? Okay.
Yeah.
So, it does illustrate attitudes about 19th century women's health, both physical and mental. And something we need to learn a little bit about before we get into this. I'm going to give you a brief description of Charlotte Perkins Gilman, the person, but I think we're going to let her talk here in a second. She was born in 1860 and died in 1935. What's interesting about her is that she had an absentee father. She was abandoned. And apparently her father was a very brainy reader, and her mother apparently was traumatized by this relationship and sort of forbid her from being excessively intellectual, which is a theme that we'll see play out through the rest of the story or whatever. So she's kind of an autodidact. She would tell lies and say she was in one place but go to the library and things like that. But let's let her own words speak. She would, I believe in 1913, I think that's the date, and you guys can find this on a website, people.virginia.edu. She wrote a brief article / essay, whatever you want to call it, called Why I Wrote the Yellow Wallpaper. And I'm just going to read it aloud. It's in the public domain. I can do that, and I think it will help frame our conversation. And I'm going to read it slowly because I have a tendency to talk like the Micro Machine spokesperson. Many and many a reader has asked me that. When the story first came out in the New England magazine about 1891, a Boston physician made protest in the transcript. Such a story ought not to be written, he said. It was enough to drive anyone mad to read it. Another physician, in Kansas I think, wrote to say that it was the best description of incipient insanity he had ever seen, and begging my pardon, had I been there. Now the story of the story is this. For many years I suffered from a severe and continuous nervous breakdown tending to melancholia and beyond. During about the third year of this trouble, I went in devout faith, in some faint stir of hope, to a noted specialist in nervous diseases, the best known in the country. His name was Silas Ware Mitchell, and we'll have a little bit more about him. This wise man put me to bed and applied the rest cure, to which a still good physique responded so promptly that he concluded there was nothing much the matter with me, and sent me home with solemn advice to live as domestic a life as far as possible, to have but 2 hours intellectual life a day, and never to touch pen, brush, or pencil again, as long as I lived. Right? This was in 1887. I went home and obeyed those directions for some 3 months, and came so near the borderline of utter mental ruin that I could see over. Then, using the remnants of intelligence that remained, and helped by a wise friend, I cast the noted specialist's advice to the winds and went to work again. Work, the normal life of every human being. Work in which is joy and growth and service, without which one is a pauper and a parasite, ultimately recovering some measure of power. Being naturally moved to rejoicing by this narrow escape, I wrote the yellow wallpaper, with its embellishments and additions to carry out the ideal. I never had hallucinations or objections to my mural decorations, and sent a copy to the physician who so nearly drove me mad. He never acknowledged it. The little book is valued by alienists and as a good specimen of one kind of literature. It has, to my knowledge, saved one woman from a similar fate, so terrifying her family that they let her out into normal activity and she recovered. But the best result is this. Many years later, I was told that the great specialist had admitted to friends that he had altered his treatment of neurasthenia since reading the yellow paper. It was not intended to drive people crazy, but to save people from being driven crazy, and it worked. Now, we don't get a particular analysis of American feminism here. We get, it seems like this is a pretty desperate call to try to save people from the same sort of thing that she was subjected to. Maybe we could see some sort of analogy to someone who identified as homosexual and had to undergo some sort of conversion therapy that, left them traumatized or scarred or something like that. So she felt traumatized and scarred by this rest cure that was prescribed to her. And in short, it took away all sort of intellectual stimulation from her and drove her mad, right? And she was able. The only thing that really brought her any sort of meaning was to dive back into work. So I think I thought it was particularly good to let her speak and tell us a little bit. But I think the story says more than just like, hey, don't do the rest cure, but it at least is talking to the particular situation of what was going on in the late 19th century about women with nervous conditions. I think maybe you could say because Charlotte Perkins Gilman had a young child of her own, she divorced her husband and she had some symptoms that we would call postpartum depression. But in that time, they didn't know what to call it, so they would call it a touch of nervous hysteria or anxiety or something like that. And I think maybe Jordan's done some research on that or whatever. So that is why that was her ultimate motive. But I mean, we all know how complex human beings are. She probably had a plurality of motives for writing this. We should not assume that our audience does not understand, has read this book. We should summarize it for them. I can do that. Jordan can do that. CJ can do that. Or if Jordan would like to add anything before we go into the plot summation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe some things that we can keep in mind is the date of this publication.
Yes, go on.
What struck me about this text was the fact that this was published during the height of the cult of new and the introduction of germ theory.
Go on. I don't know anything about that. Tell me.
Yeah, sure. So there's this. So this was at the turning point where our technology was getting a lot better and people were starting to understand the importance of sterilization. And I think that for me, this is particularly interesting because it's definitely a critique on this sort of modernization in medicine. And what came to mind was this one passage, if I may read.
Yes,
it's
please.
It's from Nancy Tome's The Gospel of Germs, Men, Women, and the Microbe in American Life. So I want to read this passage because I think it kind of helps us understand where John's coming from. So I'll just start off. The Gospel of Germs offered a vision of hygienic modernism that was perfectly suited to this, quote, cult of new and its perfectionist project, as historians William Leach and Jackson Lears have respectfully termed it. There is no better way to demonstrate an up-to-date outlook than by rejecting the unscientific and potentially deadly customs of the Victorian era. The cult of the new and the Gospel of Germs were but two facets of the same enthusiastic pursuit of modernity. So I thought that attitude would help inform us and help sort of frame this character of John and why he's making his wife do all of these things.
Yes. So I think that's a great. I think having her own voice and having this cult of the perfect, the new. I think this will inform our conversation a great deal. CJ, would you like to say anything before we start to summarize it? Okay, so I can summarize it. I've listened to it a number of times. I have to say this. I have got to give props where props are due. So there is an absolutely beautiful recitation of this text done by a woman. I believe her name is Michelle Sullivan or Megan Sullivan or whatever. It's on YouTube. It's about a half hour long. It is the most sad and beautiful confessional journal entry. And I don't know. And I've heard two different audiobook versions. I can only imagine that this one most closely approximates what Charlotte Perkins Gilman would have wanted. And I think anyone would be benefited if they took the time. It's only a half hour.
Yeah, it's lovely. Yeah.
What did you think about the audiobook that on YouTube that exists for this?
Oh, I mean, I enjoyed it tremendously. I listened to it like at least 3 or 4 times.
It's so polite, but there's so much sadness in her voice.
Yeah, it's hauntingly beautiful.
Yeah, it really is. I might be one of the best audiobooks that I've ever encountered. And it's free, so go check it out. Okay, so do you want to summarize? You want me to summarize?
I'll let you summarize.
All right, so here we go. We have a narrator. Do we know the narrator's name from the jump? Do we ever really know the narrator's name? No, we don't really know who this narrator is. It's written from our perspective where she is writing in a journal, right? And she's doing so without permission. She's not really allowed to do this because we'll find out she has been prescribed something like the rest cure, right? And she is married to a man named John, okay? John is who? John is both her husband and her physician, and she has a brother who is also a physician. And they have diagnosed her with having this form of nervous hysteria or whatever. And the cure, she must be very bourgeois. I mean, for her to be able to have this sort of cure, they've got to go out into the country for 3 months and rent this massive mansion. I need my notes. Sorry. They rent this massive mansion, right? And she shows up at the mansion and she can't understand why it's empty. It's this beautiful thing with like this lush garden and like and all this stuff, but it's ultimately empty, available. So she's just going to take 3 months off, and her physician has said, her husband and physician, right, has said thank you very much. Her husband and physician has said that she is to do nothing. Right, he totally micromanages her life. Like he tells her when she's going to eat, when she's going to sleep, all of this. Now, something that doesn't really play. Every once in a while, we are reminded that she has recently given birth to a child that she has no interaction with. Yeah. Her husband's sister, Mary, largely takes care of her and the child, and consequently, she is confined to this upper room of this ancestral home, and it's coated in this, what she would just say, this lurid yellow wallpaper, right? And it's faded in some spots, it's orange in some spots. It has this pattern that's very asymmetrical. She can't figure it out, right? It has a particular smell that she can only describe as yellow, right? It looks like this room, she says, must have been a nursery in the past. The windows are barred. The bed is nailed down.
Nursery turned gymnasium.
Yeah, nursery turned gymnasium. All these things will be important on some level. John, her husband, as he's trying to cure her, right? How does he treat her? like a child, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, he taught my little girl, right?
Silly goose.
Yes. He doesn't take a lot of her concerns very seriously, and she's totally prohibited from doing any sort of intellectual work. Right. So that's why she has to kind of feverishly hide and write down things in which, apparently this is an amalgamation of all her journal writings or whatever. So she's not well. We get the sense that she's not well to begin with, but whatever she's been prescribed doesn't seem to be helping her, right? So she seems to descend, and this seem, because we'll talk about the different ways to talk about the cohesiveness of this story. She seems to descend into insanity and have a psychotic break. And how do we get a sense that she may be going insane? Outside of the fact that she probably suffering from postpartum depression, things are getting worse and worse on this rest cure where she's prohibited from doing work and expressing herself. Mm-hmm. What are those things that are clues that we're dealing with an unreliable narrator here?
I mean, she's seeing visions.
What kind of visions and hallucinations is she seeing?
Yeah, at least that wallpaper that you mentioned, that yellow wallpaper, seems to be moving at first. That's the first thing.
Well, the first thing she sees in the patterns of the wallpaper, she starts to see a set of eyes.
Yeah.
Right? No, that's fine enough, right? If you were to look at my couch, which no one can see here, right? If you were to look at my couch, maybe you could start to see some eyes in the couch. I've got kind of this crazy pattern on the couch or whatever. That's fine enough. But then, like CJ says, as time goes on at night, the walls seem to undulate. Mm-hmm.
It becomes a point of fixation for her.
Yes, right. She's understimulated. She's not allowed to read or write or anything like that. She kind of starts to read
the paper.
Yeah, she kind of starts to read the wallpaper like a map or like a text or something like that. And it starts to undulate. She sees these eyes, and eventually, what does she start to see?
She sees a woman.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, a woman. Women,
and then multiple women.
Yeah, and then multiple women trapped behind the wallpaper, and sometimes, especially in the moonlight, they look like they're behind prison bars, right? But she's the only one that can see it, okay? All right. Now the story kind of slowly goes on. She has a couple of episodes or whatever. Ultimately, she communes with one of these hallucinations, right? And what do?
I mean, at one point, they all get, strangled.
No. Trying to break well, not quite.
But they break the wallpaper.
They
try to tear it off.
Yes, her and one of the apparitions, they
strangle off the wallpaper.
They rip the wallpaper off, right? And she wants to free them. She wants to make sure that they can get out, right? So they're not trapped behind the wallpaper, okay? And she's done this, and she's boarded herself up in her room, right? And John gets word of this or whatever. Mm-hmm. And how does the story ultimately climax? It's a little ambiguous, and I'll talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, because, he tried, the door's locked, and she's like, oh, silly man, you such a futile attempt to try to break in right now, and he's saying that he wants an axe, he's about to, break in, and she collects herself, and she's just like, check under the plantain leaf, it should be right there. Go grab the key. And she actually has to convince her husband to go get the key.
And that's because she threw it there, right?
Right. And so John barges in, either through the key or whatever. He barges in, and what happens to John when he beholds the scene of all the wallpaper ripped off and whatever else is going on? What does he do?
Faints.
He faints. The scientific cult of the new doctor, who can't be rattled by anything imaginary.
Right. Not a fan of superstition.
Right. Faints. And then we get this narration from our unnamed narrator who, she says at the end, she's like, I'm going to get out in spite of you and Jane. Mm-hmm. Now we'll have a question about who Jane is. I think Jane might be the narrator's name, and I have a theory about why she is disassociated from that. It might be because she's had some sort of psychotic break. She's lost the center of the self, and she sees herself as all these women behind there, and she's sort of left the prison of reason and been, has joined with these hallucinations, and she's no longer subject to her condition anymore. But we'll talk more about that as we go on. And she's just she creeps over him, and she crawls over him. And you can understand why people receive this and were like, this is a form of incipient insanity. That a lot of the literary critics who read this at the time, they're like, and this is why we don't let women read and write and vote and do literature, because look at what they do when we allow them to read and write and stuff like that. They go and cook up crazy nonsense. And Charlotte Perkins Gilman goes, read it again. Go back and read it. And I'm telling you, as someone who has read it 8 times, this is the text that keeps on giving. This is an amazing text that I am so thankful for Jordan bringing to my attention. And I hope they make a full feature movie out of it one day, because you could tell it in so many different ways. I don't know if I said this on camera earlier. All the different interpretive lenses that you could look at this through, you could probably make 7 different movies, or like maybe each scene could be a different movie. Have I adequately summarized it? Did I leave big things out, or do you think that's enough?
I think the big things
good.
we're going
Good
to
overview.
actually go into. So,
All right. Do you guys feel pretty good about my summation?
Good overview.
Okay.
thank you.
So, what we want to do here, I have 3 major topics that I want to talk about. Okay? And I'm sure Jordan has some that she wants to talk about too. But we'll just kind of weave them. Maybe I'll do this one first, since we just did the plot summarization, and then we'll do some of the ones that you have next. Is that okay?
Sure, that's fine.
All right, okay. So I'm asking you here, what is really going on in this story? Okay? All right. Like, is this just a woman who descends into insanity because she's been prescribed the rest cure and has a psychotic break, and it just makes her sicker and sicker, where she sees women in the wall and she ultimately loses her center of her psyche and splits into this sort of schizophrenic mess, and that this causes John to faint like a Victorian woman, right? Ooh, right? Is that all that's going on there? Because it seems like to me there's more going on there. And I'll tell you why. I have a couple reasons to think that there may be more going on there. The first is, I wonder if she's really in an insane asylum, okay? And I think these interpretations that I'm offering here, I actually don't think any of them are mutually exclusive. I think there's a way to make them all compatible. So she could have a psychotic break. She's either in the insane asylum or she's remembering something from the insane asylum. But the reason why I think she might be in an insane asylum is the fact that the bed is nailed down, presumably so it can't be positioned in a way that someone could do something to themselves from it, right? Mm-hmm. The windows have bars on it, not because it's a nursery, because doesn't want her to throw herself outside the window or whatever. It's, this place is abandoned for some legal reasons. Presumably there's going to be all sorts of reformations about how we treat mental disorders or whatever at this particular time. It wouldn't be surprising to me that some bad stuff went on there or something like that. And furthermore, her husband is a physician, and one can only speculate that he would know of such a facility. And maybe this accounts for why it's been abandoned in some way.
And maybe also why he seems to leave in the morning and then maybe come at certain times in the evening.
Maybe he's not really living there. Maybe there's like this is an inpatient treatment center of some sort.
Right, and he only come during the evening after he works to just stop
or
by.
visitor hours.
Yeah, something like that. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I think there is text to support that. I just want to put that out
sure.
there.
And how does that affect your interpretation of the text, that she is just this person that thinks she's fine and on vacation when she's actually in an asylum, or just...
Well, it raises a lot of interesting questions about the tense of when all this is occurring, right? And and it raises interesting questions about what is real, right? Yeah. Like, depending on these different layers that I'm going to add here, like, are the women behind the wall real, or are those hallucinations, right? Now, the next sort of layer I'm going to add to is they might be real on a level, and that comes from the next thing that I'll do. And we'll talk about this ultimately, what you guys think is probably the most likely case of what's going on here. So the next thing I want to put forward here is that this ancestral home might actually be haunted. That this might be a ghost story. And I've got some textual support for why I think this might be a ghost story. At the very beginning, she says, a colonial mansion, a hereditary estate, I would say a haunted house, and reach the height of romantic felicity, but that would be asking too much of fate. Further on, she talks of John. John is practical in the extreme. He has no patience with faith and intense horror of superstition, and he scoffs openly at any talk of things not to be felt and seen and put down in figures. All right? So things that can't be touched, right? The legal trouble, right, that she brushes off is something that goes on with air. She says that spoils my ghostliness, There's the talk about they get a heavy rain.
Yeah.
And the smell of the wallpaper follows her wherever she goes. It's all over the house. Even when she goes on a carriage ride, she turns around and it's there. Mm-hmm. That sounds like an apparition to me. Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think those are maybe some of the cases for thinking that maybe we've got a ghost story here on our hands. And maybe these are ghosts of women that were prescribed the rest cure that ultimately met an untimely demise and now haunt this ancestral home that is abandoned. Maybe this all fits together. And the last piece that I think may explain some of this, though it is not explicit, I think she kills herself. I think that's the only way to make sense of why John faints. John is a physician. He has seen everything. He has seen people probably with legs missing. He's probably seen cancers. He's seen all sorts of things, and he has got his constitution that allows him to, with steely rationalism, confront everything. Okay? I think he either sees one of two things, right? Like, she talks about having this rope that she hid from Mary, right? And she says, I have to tie up the woman so she can't leave. Right, and she's barricaded herself in. She's moved the bed. Before she even talks about that. There are a couple passages that are premonitions of suicide. Okay, here are some passages talking about the yellow wallpaper itself. I never saw a worse paper in my life. One of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study. And when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide. Plunge off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard of contradictions. Okay? There's our first intimation that maybe this is suicide. Then he talks about her health and well-being, and she mutters, I might be better in body, perhaps. And then he says, don't even entertain that you're not better in mind, because your mind is so imaginative, you may go off the deep end. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, he talks about how she thinks about the whole situation with the paper and everything like that is driving her mad. She thinks about jumping out the window, but she wouldn't do that because of how it would look. And there's a bunch of other stuff, okay? It seems like there's this ultimate M. Night Shyamalan move here that's going on where she may be hanging herself, and that is the thing that causes John to pass out. Or, in the process of destroying her being, she might go behind the wall and become one of these women, and he encounters the ghost of his wife. Because she does say, in spite of you and Jane, it's saying to me that she is disassociated with her identity, and that John and Jane, I said this to you guys off camera earlier, John and Jane are typically the names for people who have been murdered that we don't have the identities for. John and Jane Doe. This says to me that maybe Jane is a cadaver, and we're getting a perspective from someone who is dead. Not unlike how Bruce Willis is in M. Night Shyamalan's. Yeah. What's that movie? Signs? Or
Sixth Sense.
Sixth Sense.
Signs
right?
is a different movie.
So I think there's a way that all these can fit together. What do you guys think?
What did she say the rope was for again?
To tie up the woman.
So to continue this idea of multiple identities, I think my mind just kind of bursted for a second. What if... I think that goes to your theory because, okay, I got to tie up the woman, and the woman is herself. So she's just like, I got to go hang myself. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then maybe that would imply that she already did it, and then she's just having because that passage happens a little before the ending. So then that almost implies that she... Did she say that before she says, oh, it's... The keys are over here? Yeah. Okay. So what if...
So she's like, I'm so clever. I've secreted away this rope. And
right.
Yeah, because I think this would be a pertinent time to talk about time itself in the text, because it's off of your theory, Luke, then it's disjointed. If she just has this break with reality, she's not going to think of time or view time in a linear way.
So what if it was this Bruce Willis thing too, where she's calling out? Mm-hmm. She thinks she's calling out to her husband, and isn't it funny how the husband doesn't seem to react at all to what she's saying?
Wait, when?
when she's calling out that the keys are there. The keys.
Oh, he's reacting.
That's true.
He's going nuts. He's going to break down the door with an axe.
Right.
He's definitely reacting.
He's reacting, but does he hear her? Or
I don't know if we know that. Yeah. I mean, she says it. Oh, silly John. It's just underneath the plantain.
Right, and she says it 6 times or 7 times.
But she could easily unlock the door from within. But she doesn't, which says to me that she's either already suspended from a noose or she's about to jump and do it.
Right.
Because she wants to astonish him. But I don't know how much this matters, right?
Well, it's the ending, and it's
the story. I mean, it's the arc. It's cool.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe we're getting too.
But what matters are the ideas that it conveys, and I'll get into what some of those ideas may be. But you guys can keep talking about it. It just took me a half hour to do all that.
Yeah. So let's get into is there any idea about madness, or at least and maybe like how it could be caused, or maybe the negatives of that you want to explore?
There is. I want to make sure that we don't. I've done so much talking. I want to make sure I don't trample over any of the concerns that Jordan may have. So let's just pause for a second and see what Jordan's perspective is on what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I actually didn't really think about so much of the suicide theory or sort of just being sort of an apparition or ghost at that point. I took it almost sort of like very literally, and it was kind of my interpretation. And this might be just kind of like my sort of like historical geekiness of him passing out at the sight of his wife not being the like stereotypical perfect Victorian woman and having this complete break and just kind of like scuttling about in the room. So I mean, I took it as much
sort of thing.
So exactly. So I kind of took it as a much more literal interpretation of it. But yeah, I mean, I would say that like what I thought was interesting was I thought it was kind of sort of like almost a study in sort of like optics and sensory processing and stuff like that. And I think that has to do a lot of the functions of like things moving and her moving throughout time and space and stuff like that. So, I mean, I think that we addressed a lot of the stuff that I wanted to like talk about.
Are you good?
Yeah. So I think that in terms of a soapbox, I don't really have much.
All right. Well, let's go on here a little bit. Okay. Let's go on here a little bit. So, now is this just Charlotte Perkins Gilman saying something about, hey, the rest cure is bad, cut that out? Or is she trying to say something more from her individual situation about the plight of women in the 19th century that is still applicable today? And I think something that I had to ask myself is, if this is a feminist text, I have to understand what exactly feminism is, okay, in order to do a feminist reading of this. Okay. And I had to look up the different waves of feminism. So let's talk about maybe some feminist themes that are in this and maybe see how they apply to the different waves of feminism so we can get an understanding of how this could be construed as an American feminist text. So I free wrote some ideas that may be applicable to the idea of this being a feminist text. The fact that at that time, and maybe today, women are not allowed to properly express themselves, and that this right that
accurate.
And I want you to speak to this, Jordan, okay?
Yeah.
All right, that this leads to a madness of sorts, okay? That the intellectual stimulation was seen as something not fit for the fragile character of woman, right? That these are some of the oppressive feminist themes that were going on at the time, so they had to be micromanaged. And that really there's no joy in domesticity, right? That there is no joy in the marriage, right? There is no joy, that this is a false bill of goods that have been sold to women, that happiness ultimately lies in having a husband and a child, when it seems to create a sort of prison, right? They're imprisoned within that sort of slavish relationship, and perhaps more so if they suffer from postpartum depression and a man micromanaging them. And this idea of her wanting to emancipate the hallucinations, the apparitions from behind the wall. Perhaps this applies to something more universal, maybe suffrage, something of that nature. It was a movement gaining traction at that time. So yeah. And maybe there's an ultimate struggle here between reason and feelings. We talked about this sort of contradiction that is the pattern on the yellow wallpaper. John, like you said, represents this sort of cult of the new, the cult of the perfect. Maybe he represents the philosopher.
Yes, that's kind of like what I kind of seemed like to go with. That was kind of my interpretation, was this tension between what's sort of intuitive, what's really creative, what's abstract, what might seem irrational but like flourishing. And sort of like this sort of like generative power balanced with this kind of like clinical sterilizing sort of I don't know how to describe that, sort of like steely rational sentiment.
Yeah, like he's constantly like feeding her like phosphates or phosphites and cod liver
tonics
oils,
and this, that, and the other thing.
Yeah,
and,
precisely.
Right.
I also thought it was kind of interesting, some of the symbolism here. I wonder if it's by accident that she is in the uppermost floor of the house, right? Think about the human body, right? What do we usually talk about? Head versus heart, right?
Yep.
The philosopher is typically associated with things up here, right? So
tower,
she's elevated to the Platonic realm.
Right. And she wanted to be out in the lower rooms with the piazza and the flowers and the breezes and the loveliness.
Right. So we might have a little bit of we might have a situation where women are sort of expected to conform to what is, and maybe there's some misogynism in this, what is considered to be the manly idea of rationalism or something like that. Now we can call that into question. She's expected to conform to John's world, to the prevailing norms of that time, and that her feelings about self-expression, stuff like that, are not to be taken very seriously. And she's not allowed to participate, really.
Right. She's kind of caught between two worlds, because she is clearly educated, because she said, oh, this sort of defies any of my abilities to classify the stuff. She used, like, I think a term like a debased Romanesque, and she just said this, it defies all or any of the laws of, like radiation and like symmetry and balance and stuff like that. And she just even threw in a couple of like Latin terms, So, I mean, really, it seems as if she's really creative but intellectual at the same time, and she's kind of caught in between these two identities, and she's not really successfully able to integrate those sort of aspects of herself.
Well, I don't know. In some ways, maybe she is with writing, because there's that great saying that the in between of the head and the hearts is the hand, or I don't know, where it's like you can, in some way, maybe like the writing, the process is maybe her way of doing that, of making the head and the heart some way come together in her writing. But
yeah. And I think Perfect 2 comes to mind is a little bit of Simone de Beauvoir like rings true for me with this, is that idea of being able to have these projects to make you like sort of like a concrete person and like have your life have meaning. So it seems to me that she can actualize herself through the writing, but according to John, that's not an acceptable way for her to sort of make her life meaningful.
And so in that way, that is a testament to not only the rescuer, but again, I guess what Luke said, or this idea that women, any kind of creative or productive creative work is not looked down upon, but it's like, is that your function really? It's this weird sort of dismissal of that.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, this is kind of like a little bit of a reach, but I almost kind of seemed like the wallpaper sort of like a map of the mind.
Yeah. And so what would be the woman trapped in that?
Yeah, so I kind of thought maybe that's where I didn't really I wasn't really quite unable to unpack.
I mean, could that be their, and maybe in that way of thinking, it could be their true potential that is trapped somehow, and it can only get out when people don't expect it during the day, because obviously, like she says in the story, that they don't escape during the night. That would just be too suspicious. They escape during the day, and then maybe maybe that, if you want to use your analogy, it could be some way of elucidating on how the mind, I don't know, maybe it's like you guys women are trying to get free in some way, or that the mind can be freed, or these women are trapped, not using their potential, and then the mind, and that they just want to get free,
right,
in some way.
Yeah, and like kind of explore like their intellects.
Yeah.
God forbid.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose then that comes to the point of what was the thought danger of that? You know, what did people think would happen if women did do that? Like, I suppose it would be this story, right? Like Luke said in the beginning, like, this is what happens. You get these crazy stories. Yeah.
That's why we can't have nice things and give women pen and paper to write.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, maybe because it goes against gender norms?
Yeah, and I think that maybe it would be helpful looking at gender norms if we talked a little bit of the different waves of feminism.
Mm-hmm. Which...
Well, I would love to do that, except I'm getting the pinwheel of death on Jordan's computer, and this one is too far outside for me to really read. I think what's more important is for maybe Jordan to speak to...
Oh, boy. Jordan hot seat.
I mean, how relevant do you believe this text to be to the contemporary situation? Obviously, yeah. You know, obviously this says something about the first wave of feminism that was dealing primarily with universal suffrage. And I could talk about second, third, fourth wave feminism, but I think it'd be better for you to say something about how this text illuminates the lived experience of being a woman.
No pressure. Yeah, I mean, I would say that I've been very fortunate in my education to attend schools and environments that really fostered and facilitated intellectual growth. But yeah, I mean, like there are like, if we look at the numbers for like women in STEM fields, the numbers are still like pretty skewed right now, and that's because it's sort of, and it's an ethos that I even kind of grew up believing, so I've sort of inched away from math and sciences, was that, oh, well, it's not becoming of a girl really to be into like engineering or think that like calculus is like really cool. Mm-hmm. So there are certain disciplines I think that are pushed more towards women, and right now that trend is reversing, and I'm like absolutely thrilled to see that. But yeah, I would say that for me, I was like, oh well, you know, in grade school, I was like terrified of math. I was like, oh, I'm like too dumb to get this. Like all the other kids are getting it, and especially the boys. So like, this isn't for me. Time to move on.
What about micromanagement? Do you feel micromanaged by the patriarchy?
Whoa. Whoa.
If John is the philosopher, the scientist, the cult of the new,
yeah.
Do you feel micromanaged by that in some way?
Depends with this transition of power. Might feel a little bit more micromanaged in a little bit. We'll have to see about that.
Do you feel uncomfortable speaking to that?
No, I mean, I definitely think that, patriarchal system's been going for like a couple thousand years, and, the whole point of it is to disenfranchise a lot of groups and to control groups. So yeah, I mean, I would say that, you know, there are like definitely like limitations in my day-to-day experiences due to the patriarchy, like discrepancies in wage, access to, you know, healthcare, you know, stuff like that, you know, affects my daily life for sure. Yeah, like
I know I'm really putting you on the spot.
Yeah.
You don't have to go deeper if you don't want to.
I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things that as a female, and I think other women can attest to this, it's just something that it happens to you so frequently in a way that it's part of your experience. So it's like, someone stared at me a little bit too long today at the grocery store, you know, like more than I'm comfortable with. It's just one of those things you get so used to, you just kind of like tune out.
Mm.
Right, and maybe that's the goal of the drugging and everything that John does in the story, is to tune it out. But maybe another layer of our narrator looking at the wallpaper is that maybe we could say, is seeing all of the injustice, or it's an analogy to this idea that if you were to actually pay attention to everything that's going on, not to say you would go insane, but there is some
you'd be crushed by the overwhelming weight of that sort of oppression if you take it into its entire totality.
Right. Which probably our narrator did in some respect.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that just kind of goes to show that, I mean, as as difficult as it can be to be a female or basically a non-white male in in our society, there's always like a level of negotiations and discourse that's happening at some level. So I think that with this sort of like creativity and that output and that writing that she wants to do, that's her way of being able to accommodate in a culture that ultimately wants to keep her sort of in this sort of infant state and not actually sort of like realize her true potential. So, yeah. I mean, I don't know. You guys just keep asking away.
No, that's fine. Well, I mean, so I think what we're telling people is that this text is as relevant now as it ever was. It's not like it's just speaking to the political situation of how mental and physical health was handled.
Yeah,
in the late
I mean,
19th
I think
century.
it just
Still
goes to show.
relevant today.
Yeah, I would say like in terms of like women's health, and I'd say just like medicine in general, that I think that there's a sort of a pushback. I think, which I think is fascinating to see, of this acknowledgement. Hey, doctors don't know everything. So I think that it's a little bit of an approach of saying, hey, you know what, this whole sterile clinical approach isn't 100%, so we need to meet it halfway with a more holistic or a more creative approach to things.
Do you find misogyny in the way that modern science is practiced?
I mean, yes, I would say, like, I don't know, like Henrietta Lacks was like the first person that came to mind. I'm not really quite sure why she jumped to mind.
Who is that?
Henrietta Lacks was a woman who, I believe she had like a biopsy done, and it turns out that her cells were basically just sort of like this like amazing, she had cancer, but her cells had this amazing like regenerative property. And so a bunch of scientists, I think it was at Johns Hopkins, took these cells and just without her knowledge or her consent just kept like reproducing them in the lab. Yeah. So they're sort of like these like immortal cells, and they're called HeLa cells. So that's the sort of stuff. And I mean, like women have been sterilized, especially in the South, like for rural black women in the South. It was actually called, so prevalent, it was called a Mississippi appendectomy, where you would go in for a routine surgery and you would wake up and have a hysterectomy.
Oh.
So that's why. So I think in terms of health, overall, like mental health, physical health, yeah, I would say that disputes over screenings, necessary contraceptives, etc. I definitely say is a huge part of this discourse that we are experiencing today. So I would say that a lot of these themes, balancing your aspects as an individual and as a parent, which, I think that's like a issue that is faced with not just women, but like men too, of how do you keep aspects of yourself like professionally or your own identity and as a parent, and how do you balance those roles?
Okay, cool. Did we address that subject adequately? Or are there more that need to be addressed? Because I have one more thing that I'd like to cover.
Yeah, go for it.
And unless you have more.
No, I mean, if I
Unless you
feel like if the spirit moves me, I'll jump in.
You do have that Quaker background.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. So we're good?
Yep, we're good.
Okay. All right. Okay. Thank you for sharing your experience there, Jordan.
Thanks.
All right. So the final thing I want to talk about here. Okay. There is a thing called color psychology. Did you all know that?
Woohoo!
Yeah.
All right. I did not really know this. Now, what prompted me to look into this was something unrelated to the yellow wallpaper. Okay, something that I did. I was downstairs on Saturday night watching the Iowa versus Michigan college football game, okay? Mm-hmm. And guess what Iowa did to Michigan even before the game got going?
What?
They had painted, and perhaps they do this for all the visiting teams, they had painted their locker room pink. The point being that this would be an enervating, demoralizing color so that they wouldn't be able to go out there like these warriors and take on Isle or whatever, right? And so apparently there is this notion that certain colors have both a negative and a positive side that can afflict both good and negative feelings, right? And it can be traced back pretty far. I'll just tell you a little bit about it. This is from Wikipedia. And I'll tie it back into, because obviously yellow, she named the damn book, the Yellow Wallpaper. Like, this is very important, right? Like, so color psychology is a study of hues as a determinant of human behavior. Color influences perceptions that are not obvious, such as the taste of food. Colors can also enhance the effectiveness of placebos. For example, red or orange pills are generally used as stimulants. All right, so we can go on and on about that. I found an image of what I believe the yellow wallpaper to look like. Okay? I'll show people on camera if they're watching on YouTube or Facebook what I think it looks like. Oh, that's terrible. There we go. I don't know if it'll show up there. There you go. Now, what I want you and CJ to do, I want you to look at that. Really take it in.
Decay. Ugh.
What is it? Do some free association for me. What do you what's that make you think?
Antiquated.
I think just aged. Faded.
Sick.
Rustic.
Yeah,
ill,
like
sick.
Sickly, sort of rotted somehow.
Fetid.
Yeah.
You good?
Like it. Ugh,
yeah, you don't like it, right? Like, it would.
Good.
So what if that was your lived existence? What if that is something that you had
I'd easily go crazy.
3 months.
I would go crazy. Yep,
Right.
that would. I'd
Right.
tear that down in like 3 days.
So what's very interesting is that yellow is a sort of yellow, but it has been yellowed in a way. Now there are certain types of
The
yellow.
yellowing of yellow.
Well, there is, right?
Yeah.
So like, let's
she
think.
even mentions like the buttercup yellow. She's like, this isn't like the pleasant buttercup yellow, or like one of like a dandelion. Like even like dandelion yellow is nice.
So even if we did have a perfectly yellow room, typically that is associated, like, people will paint the walls like bright yellow because it's intellectually stimulating.
It's sunny. Yeah.
Heart, like, think about things that are yellow, right? Like legal pads, like this is going to be like provoke some great interjection in court or something like that. Hard hats so people can see you or something like that. School buses so that everybody knows what's up. Snakes even have like yellow markings saying like, get the hell away from me or something like that. But if it constantly puts you on a state of alert, well, that can be exhausting. And what is our narrator throughout this entire thing?
I mean, the whole point is for her is not to be stimulated, and she's just like completely like with her like sensory input is just overloaded
To the point of exhaustion. Yeah.
To the point of exhaustion, right? And she's also there, and she's also made really sick too, right?
Yeah.
She talks about the kind of sulfur-like smell of that yellow. And what's interesting is that Goethe and Schiller, they developed a color wheel and like and talked a great deal about all of this. So I think I could quote some Goethe, Maria Popova, we are a big fan of from Brain Pickings. She covered, she did a whole article on this, and Goethe wrote a great deal about the effects of the color of yellow. But that has to be some aspect of it too that I wanted to cover there. Is that the everything in the story is significant. Everything from the tints change to the name of it to the name that she exclaims out at the end of In Spite of You and Jane. Everything in this story has a purpose. So those were the major themes that I wanted to cover, which brings us to about 53 minutes.
Yeah.
So Luke, playing the role of John, has completely dominated and micromanaged his opposites. Stage an insurrection. Tell me what I'm doing wrong. Tell me what I've overlooked. Anything?
I mean, I'd say one thing that we haven't really discussed, and I think that, I mean, I don't want to completely, like, bore our listeners to tears, but we haven't really talked about madness that much, and I wanted to bring it up because, CJ, I know that you've read a little bit of Foucault, and to me, I think was really interesting were these insights of, sort of, like, of clearness and, like, lucidity that she had in this madness, and I think that we probably should touch on a little bit more about power dynamics, too.
Go.
So I thought it was interesting with, the narrative where, on the edition that I read, it was on page 655. And John she just point blank says, it's cute that he's pretending to care about me, but I see right through it. He doesn't really care. I see right through him. Which is interesting because I don't think that, because previously in the text she says, oh, well, he's very careful and loving. He hardly lets me stir without special direction. So she's under this lull of, I am right under his thumb. And it's a little bit almost, to mind, it almost reminded me a little bit of the psychology of an abusive relationship.
Yes.
And that power exchange of, they're domineering, but they love me, but it's for my own good.
Right.
And then later in the text, she calls it, she's just like, this is bullshit. I see right through this facade of care. You just want to control me.
She's smarter than John.
She is. Yeah.
She knows more than he does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
But but the power dynamics are such that she feels like she must submit. Right?
Yeah,
and this
and
is
that construct. So I feel like that for her, she almost has to, the madness for her is a conduit to basically take almost she takes refuge in the madness in order to escape that power dynamic that society has set up for her.
So you think
it
the
is
madness?
I see it as a trap door.
Yeah,
I see her saying bye and
yeah,
just,
and madness is also a way to chain her down too. Society can just say, "Oh, she's mad."
They are very dismissive.
You're just depressed, and
you're
in a way that any sort of completely logical objections to her treatment, whatever she says, can just be deemed as, it's just part of the system, right? It's part of the system of curing that, this is why we're doing it, so you don't have these thoughts, even though they are completely logical. Again, that power.
Right, and she says, repeats throughout the text, literally in the first page, she says, this is what my brother and my husband are saying, but I don't think they're right. I think that just getting back to work and a change of pace would be the best thing for me. Mm-hmm. So she already knows going into it what's best for her.
Well, it's very autobiographical, right? Because isn't that what our author does anyway?
Right.
Yeah, she makes reference. She says I have a friend who saw Weir Mitchell.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So it made reference, and he's even worse than my husband and my brother.
Yeah.
Because he threatens her. He's like, if you don't get better soon, we're sending you to Weir Mitchell.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that interpretation of thinking about madness as the escape from that power dynamic. I think that's a really good insight.
Yeah. So I don't know. To me, it just seems like there's sort of that, that clearness, because they're just at some points in the text where she just, even with was it with Jennifer, right? She sees Jennifer touching the paper, and you might think that she's getting
Jenny. Yeah, I mixed up Mary and Jenny. Yes,
she's getting weirdly possessive about the paper, but maybe Jennifer sees something in the paper too,
and maybe John does too, right? She catches John examining it, and he has smooches of the yellow coloring all over him, right? And she sneaks up on Jenny, and she says, "What are you looking at? Do you see what I see?" And she's like, "Oh, I'm just trying to understand the mystery of why your clothes are so dirty."
Right.
And she's like, an innocent enough explanation, but she's like, she sees what I see too.
Yeah, exactly.
She wishes she could be me, maybe. In some way,
yeah.
She wish because she's
because you ain't me.
Yeah, Jenny is an interesting foil to our narrator, because Jenny's perfectly well behaved, right?
Yeah,
and we don't know a lot about the interior life of Jenny.
We don't.
We just know she does her brother's bidding and takes care of the narrator.
Yeah. That's another movie.
Yeah, it certainly is.
Yeah, so if we're talking about the alternate realities, right? Maybe that Jane is the sort of alternate reality of Jenny.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I find it interesting that you touch on that power dynamic, because it almost reminds me of what we've been talking about with Jacques Derrida too, where you're always caught within the circle that to escape the system, you think madness would work. But yet madness is a part of that system because it has to be cured. Mm-hmm. And so you're still working within the game. And we have the narrator, a person that is trapped within this game who is trying to escape, but in her escape she is still playing in the game. Even if you're Wile E. Coyote in the Roadrunner, even if you escape if Wile E. Coyote can't catch the Roadrunner, just because the Roadrunner escaped, just because that doesn't mean anything, because they're just going to do it another episode, right? It's just going to keep
Really?
chase.
I almost see it that she's just like partaking in a different reality.
Yeah.
And because she's just like in a different reality, like she's just like.
So
she doesn't have to deal with these.
She's not
this
even in any,
shenanigans
she's
anymore.
not even in
Yeah.
any kind of circle at all. She's just kind of like
She's like in her own, like literally, quite literally in her own circle, like going about the room.
And you don't think that
She is. That's a good point. That you want to talk about cycle. She is going around the room like Jordan said. She goes round and round and round and round. There's
She might be like in her own cosmos.
Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't think she's still within this. I mean, at least within the other characters, she's still within this circle of being cured and of thinking of herself as.
I think that she finds her own madness as the cure, because she even says with the wallpaper, "I'm better because of the wallpaper."
Right.
And,
And,
and that's an interesting thing how is the wallpaper making her better? Is it because it's providing intellectual stimulation, or is it showing her a way out? And is that?
I think it's showing her a way out. I think that, like, either the like whatever conduit of sort of finding purpose and intellectual stimulation, or it drives you crazy enough, which is the route out.
And the route out ultimately seems to be, like I indicated earlier, that the route out may be suicide.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. Not that that's an endorsement of that.
No.
but maybe that's what.
Well, again, that kind of plays right into back into the game. Yeah. Then if it's just like suicide, then it's like you're still playing within the clinical kind of view of like, oh, like we must not have those thoughts, because if you do, you could lead to bad things, right? Like John says. So.
Or you just leave the game entirely.
Yeah, that's it.
Or you acknowledge basically a contest in which you can't win, so you decide to opt out.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just like upsetting the table, like F this.
That's what I think. I think it's just a big table flip.
Yeah, that's kind of I'm a little bit with you on that.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I think.
I think that she is very insightful, and I think that she knows the game, and she, one way or another, just finds another game to partake in.
Yeah. Cool. Well, we are at the hour mark.
Whew.
We should probably bring it to a close.
I think so.
Covered a lot of terrain. You guys feel good?
Yeah.
Anything else you would like to say?
No.
All right. Thank you so much for listening. Download the Noetic app. Thank you, Jordan Cline and CJ Eller. You can get it for your iPhone and Android devices. We'll have this up on YouTube and SoundCloud momentarily. Thank you.